The year was 1881. The month was October, and the wind blowing across the high plains of Wyoming had already forgotten the kindness of summer. It was a wind that promised an early and unforgiving winter. Martha stood on the barren ground outside the orphanage gates, a single thin wool blanket folded over her arm. Her twin sister, Mary, stood beside her, clutching a small wicker basket. Inside, a scrap of orange fur shivered, a cat no bigger than a man's boot. The cold did not care that they were 17 years old today. It did not care that this was the only home they had ever known. The cold was simply what cold does. The matron stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mask of grim necessity. She was not a monster. She was simply a woman who had run out of room, both in her building and in her heart. She delivered the truth with the efficiency of a winter axe. "You are 17 now," she said, her voice flat and clear in the thin air. "The world has no more room for sentiment. You are old enough to earn your keep or old enough to starve." The gate latch clicked shut behind them. Mary opened the wicker basket just enough to look inside. Tucked beside the sleeping cat was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a hand-drawn map, left with them on this same doorstep 17 years ago, marking a piece of land nobody wanted. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Let us know in the comments below. They were not like the other girls. The orphanage was a machine designed to produce two things: compliant wives for farmers and hard-working maids for the merchant class. It ran on a curriculum of scrubbing, sewing, and scripture. Mary and Martha were faulty parts in that machine. Mary read. She did not just read the approved texts, the Bible and the moral primers left by traveling ministers. She sought out anything with print. She would trade her portion of dessert for a week-old newspaper from Cheyenne. She would mend a stable boy's shirt in exchange for a farmer's almanac. She read about crop rotation in Nebraska, about water tables in Arizona, about the strange and wonderful things people were growing in sheltered valleys in the mountains. She collected facts the way other girls collected ribbons. Martha did not read. She watched. She had a stillness about her that was often mistaken for slowness, but it was the stillness of a predator. She watched the way the wind bent the long grasses and knew which direction the storm would come from. She watched the spiders build their webs and understood structural integrity. She could tell by the behavior of the birds in the morning what the afternoon weather would be. While the other girls were learning stitches, Martha was learning the subtle language of the living world. Her knowledge was practical, rooted in the dirt and the sky. This combination of obsessive learning and quiet observation made the institution profoundly uncomfortable. They asked questions nobody wanted to answer. Mary once asked the visiting preacher why the book of Leviticus had such specific rules for agriculture if God intended them only to pray for a good harvest. The man saw blasphemy in what was, for her, a simple request for information. Martha, after a sow lost a litter of piglets, quietly suggested to the groundskeeper that the pen was too damp and faced the wrong way to catch the morning sun. She was right, but her correctness was an indictment of his experience, and he never forgave her for it. The rejection was not a single, cruel act. It was a slow, systemic sanding down of everything that made them unique. They were a problem that could not be solved by the orphanage simple formulas. A local rancher, looking for a housemaid, once observed them sitting apart from the other girls, Mary whispering to Martha from a page in a book, Martha nodding and looking toward the distant mountains. He later told the matron, "There is a wildness in them. They are not built for a hearth and home. They are staring at the horizon." He meant it as a warning. He was more right than he knew. Their world had no category for two girls who worked in perfect concert, one gathering the theory and the other testing it against the physical world. The world saw two strange, quiet orphans who were not quite right. It saw girls who preferred the company of a stray cat and a tattered almanac to that of other people. So, on their 17th birthday, the day the law said they were no longer the institution's responsibility, the world did what it always does with things it cannot categorize. It cast them out. The map was an afterthought, a piece of their history the matron was glad to be rid of. It was a deed to a quarter section of land in the Laramie Range, a place described on county rolls as unsuitable for grazing or cultivation. It was worthless. And it was all they had. The journey to the claim took them 4 days. They followed the map, which was less a map and more a sketch of a creek, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping man, and a single, hopeful X. They ate the small loaf of bread and the handful of dried apples the matron had given them. On the 3rd day, that was gone. Hunger began as a dull ache and sharpened into a constant, biting companion. The world was vast and indifferent. The mountains did not care about their quest. The endless sky offered no comfort. They found the place late in the afternoon of the 4th day. It was worse than worthless. A cabin had once stood there, but the roof had collapsed long ago, its timbers rotting into the earth. One wall remained, a skeleton against the sky. The land itself was a mix of rock and thin, stubborn grass. The wind was relentless. It was a place where things came to die. They spent the first night huddled in the corner of the one remaining wall, the thin blanket pulled over them, the small cat, Ember, tucked between them for warmth. The temperature dropped. The cold was a physical presence. It found every gap in their threadbare dresses, every seam in their worn-out shoes. The next few weeks were a descent. Survival became a series of stark, brutal calculations. A day's work was gathering enough wood to keep from freezing during the night. The wood was scarce, and their small hatchet was dull. Mary's hands, accustomed to the pages of books, were soon raw and bleeding. Martha, with her keen eyes, found a small, brackish spring, but the water had to be boiled. That meant more wood. Everything cost them calories they did not have. They set snares Martha fashioned from their own shoelaces. For 2 days, they caught nothing. On the 3rd day, a rabbit. They cooked it over the fire, eating every last scrap, boiling the bones for a thin, weak broth. It was not enough. Their bodies began to fail in quiet, specific ways. The shivering started as a tremor and became an uncontrollable shuddering that ached in their teeth and jaws. At first, the shivering was good. It meant their bodies were still fighting. Then, one morning, Mary woke up and could not feel her feet at all. There was no pain, no cold, just an absence where her feet should be. She had to crawl to the fire. Dizziness became a constant state. Standing up too quickly brought a black curtain down over their eyes. One night, the wind howled, rattling the loose timbers of the ruined wall. The fire was low. They had eaten nothing but boiled roots for 2 days. They lay in the dark, listening to the vast, empty silence of the wilderness. It was Martha who spoke first, her voice a dry whisper. "Maybe we should go back." Mary didn't answer immediately. She thought of the town they had passed through. The poorhouse. The warmth of a crowded room, the certainty of a bowl of thin oatmeal. Even the oatmeal she had hated at the orphanage seemed like a forgotten luxury. They could go back. They could beg. They could admit the world was right about them. This was where their story ended, in the ruins of a cabin on a worthless piece of land. They could lie down and let the cold take them. It would be an easy thing. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy as a shroud. And then, a new sound entered the night. It was a tiny, vibrating rumble. Ember, curled on Mary's chest, began to purr. It was a small, ridiculous sound in the face of such overwhelming despair. A tiny engine of life, insisting on a future. The sound was so absurd, so defiantly alive, that it broke the spell. The body acts before the mind catches up. Mary's hand moved, stroking the cat's thin fur. The simple, physical act was an anchor. Then a sentence surfaced in her memory, something she had read in a pamphlet about farming in difficult climates. She had read it aloud to Martha weeks ago, in the orphanage garden. The land provides for them that know how to ask. It was not a prayer. It was a practical problem. They had been asking the wrong way. They had been trying to force the land to be something it was not. They had not been listening to it. The next morning, they did not search for wood. They began to clear the floor of the collapsed cabin. They were looking for anything. A dropped tool. A hidden cellar. A reason. They moved rubble for hours, their muscles screaming, their heads light with hunger. Beneath a pile of rotted timbers and packed earth, they found it. A large, flat piece of shale that did not match the other stones of the foundation. It was heavy. It took both of them, straining with a log as a lever, to move it. It slid aside with a grating groan, revealing a dark, square opening. Cool, still air rose to meet them, smelling of damp earth and limestone. It was not a cellar. It was the entrance to a cave. They lit a torch made from a resinous pine branch and descended. A short, narrow passage opened into a small, dry chamber. The walls were smooth limestone. The air was cool, but not the biting cold of the outside world. It held a steady, constant temperature. Water seeped slowly from one wall, dripping into a small, clear pool. It was fresh and clean. They did not cheer. There was no sudden rush of relief. Mary slid down the earthen wall and sat on the cold floor, the torchlight flickering on her pale face. Martha followed, sitting beside her. They just sat there, in the quiet dark, breathing in the mineral smell of the earth. It was a feeling for which they had no word. It felt like recognition. This was the gift. Not the rocky soil or the relentless wind. This. The land had been holding this for them all along. It felt like right. The cave changed the equation. It was not a home, but it was a perfect pantry. A place to store life, safe from the heat of summer and the deep freeze of winter. The constant, cool humidity was ideal for preservation. Mary's books had described such places, natural cellars used by ancient peoples. Now, they had one of their own. Their strategy shifted. They could not outfarm the short growing season and poor soil. But they could outpreserve the winter. The sun on their high, treeless hill was intense. The wind was a constant, drying force. They would turn these liabilities into assets. They would harvest everything the land offered, no matter how small, and they would dry it. The building process began. The first task was to create the tools for their new industry. They scavenged every piece of the old cabin. A long, flat piece of metal from the rusted-out stovepipe was sharpened on a rock for hours until it could serve as a crude saw. They used it to cut the less rotted timbers into frames. They had no nails. Instead, Martha, remembering the way spiders anchored their webs, showed Mary how to drill holes with a sharpened stone and peg the frames together with dowels of hardwood, hammered into place with a heavy rock. They lashed the frames together with cordage they made from yucca fibers and boiled strips of rabbit hide. The work was brutal and slow. Their first drying rack was a wobbly, pathetic thing that collapsed under the weight of a few sliced roots. They did not despair. They examined the failure, saw where the joints were weak, and built the next one differently. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their hands and bodies aching, their conversation reduced to essential, practical things. This joint needs another peg, the brace is angled wrong, hold this steady. Slowly, a strange and beautiful architecture grew on the hillside. Dozens of wooden racks, each about 4 feet high and 6 feet long, stood in neat rows, angled to catch the maximum sun and wind. They looked like the skeletons of some strange, unknown creature. Then came the harvest. They became students of their quarter section. Mary, with her books, identified every edible plant. They gathered wild onions, cattail roots, rose hips, and berries Martha knew were safe from her observations of the birds. They learned to find the small, hardy potatoes that grew deep in the rocky soil. Martha, with the help of a better knife traded from a passing trapper, became an expert hunter of small game. Rabbits, squirrels, grouse. Every animal was treated with a kind of reverence. Nothing was wasted. The meat was sliced paper thin and laid carefully on the racks. The hides were scraped, treated with brains and smoke, and set aside for mending clothes or making pouches. The bones were boiled for stock, then burned to ash, which they used to amend the small garden plot they were attempting to cultivate near the spring. They covered the racks with cheesecloth they'd unraveled from their own petticoats, a fine mesh to keep the flies and birds away. All summer long, the hill was a scene of constant, quiet industry. The sisters moved among the racks, turning the drying meat, the sliced roots, the harvested herbs. The scent of sage and drying venison filled the air. Below them, in the cool, dark cave, their stores grew. Sacks of dried berries. Bundles of herbs. Jerky braided into long ropes. Flour ground from dried cattail roots. The first proof of their success came in late August. An old trapper named Joseph, a man who kept to the mountains and came to town only twice a year, was tracking a deer when he stumbled upon their claim. He stopped dead, staring at the improbable sight. 2 young women, a small orange cat, and a hillside covered in drying racks. He was a man who understood the hard math of winter, and he could not make this equation work. He was skeptical, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Mary and Martha simply stopped their work and watched him approach. They did not speak. Mary went to one of the finished racks and took a piece of dried venison. It was dark, almost black, and when she broke it, it snapped with a sharp crack. She held it out to him. Joseph took the jerky. He sniffed it. He examined the texture. He put it in his mouth and chewed, his eyes never leaving theirs. He chewed for a long time, the silence stretching out. He looked from the meat in his hand to the rows of racks, then to the stone slab that covered the entrance to their cave. He understood. He had spent his life reading the land, and he recognized its language here. He gave a single, sharp nod. "You'll live," he said. It was the highest praise he could offer. Joseph became their first and only ally. He was, like them, an outcast. The townspeople thought him half-mad, a man who preferred the company of pine trees to people. He saw in the sisters a competence that he recognized. He did not offer them pity or charity. He offered them trade. He brought them a sack of salt, a treasure more valuable than gold for curing meat. He brought them a proper skinning knife and a small cast iron pot. In return, they gave him dried rations, food that was light to carry and packed with energy. He taught Martha how to read the subtle signs of a predator's trail. Mary, in turn, read to him from her almanac about weather patterns, knowledge that helped him time his trapping expeditions. It was a partnership of mutual respect, built on the shared understanding of survival. As autumn deepened, word of the drying sisters trickled down into the nearby town. It was mostly a curiosity, a piece of gossip. The storekeeper laughed at the idea of 2 girls from the orphanage living out on the old Miller claim. The preacher gave a sermon about the sin of pride, warning his flock against those who would try to live apart from the community God had ordained. The town was a closed system, and the sisters were an anomaly it could not account for. Then the winter came. It came early, as Martha had predicted from the flight patterns of the geese. The first snows fell in early November and did not stop. Blizzards buried the roads. Supply wagons from Cheyenne couldn't get through. The town's resources began to dwindle. The storekeeper's shelves grew bare. Families began to ration. Hunger, once a distant threat, became a quiet guest in every home. The first to come was a farmer named Henderson. His youngest son was sick with a fever, and they had run out of food. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He walked the 7 miles to the sisters' claim through waist-deep snow, his face raw from the wind. He did not come to mock or to judge. He brought a heavy wool quilt his wife had made, one of their last true valuables. He offered it in trade. Martha led him into the cave. By the light of a tallow lamp, he saw it. The neat sacks, the hanging braids of jerky, the shelves of preserved goods. It was not a hoard. It was a library of food, meticulously catalogued and stored. It was the result of a summer of relentless, intelligent work. He left with a heavy sack of dried meat, berries, and root flour, enough to last his family for 2 weeks. He left the quilt behind. The Henderson boy got well. The family ate. And the father told another family. Then another. A thin, desperate trail was beaten through the snow to the sisters' cabin. They came with what they had, a pair of boots, a set of tools, candles, a bolt of cloth. The sisters traded fairly, never taking more than was just. They never mentioned the town's earlier scorn. They did not need to. The town was converting, not through sermons or admiration, but through the quiet, undeniable argument of hunger. They came for what the sisters produced, not for who they were. By the time the spring thaw finally came, the sisters were no longer outcasts. They were a vital part of the region's economy. They had a small herd of goats, traded for food. They had better tools. Their small garden was fenced. The drying rack stood ready for the new season. They had faced down the world's rejection and the wilderness's indifference, and they had built something new on that barren hill. They were not just surviving. They were home. Years passed. The farm on the hill became a landmark, a place of quiet abundance. The sisters' methods were no longer strange, they were simply the way things were done. People came not just to trade, but to learn. Martha would walk them through the garden, showing them how to read the soil. Mary would sit with them by the fire, explaining the principles of drying and preserving she had gleaned from her ever-growing collection of books and pamphlets. They gave their knowledge away as freely as they had given their food. Then, in the 5th year, a sickness came to the valley. It was a lung fever, fast-moving and vicious. It thrived in the close quarters of the town and hit the orphanage the hardest. The old building, damp and crowded, became an incubator for the disease. The town doctor was overwhelmed. Supplies were low. The children were weak, and their weakness made them vulnerable. One afternoon, a small, worn buggy made its way up the winding path to the cabin. A lone figure held the reins. As the buggy drew closer, the sisters recognized her. It was the matron. She was not the woman they remembered. The rigid posture was gone, replaced by a weary slump. Her black dress was faded and dusty. The certainty had been scoured from her face by fear and exhaustion. She looked smaller, diminished by a world that had finally proven too large for her rules. Ember, now a fat and stately old cat, watched her from the porch with indifferent green eyes. The matron stopped the buggy and climbed down. She did not look at their prosperous farm, at the healthy goats or the well-tended garden. She looked only at them. She did not offer a greeting. She did not speak of the past. Her request was stripped of all pretense. "The children," she said, her voice a thin, dry rasp. "The fever is in the house. They are weak. We have almost no food left." Mary and Martha looked at each other. There was no flicker of triumph in their eyes, no hint of vindication. They had spent years turning the world's cruelty into sustenance, and the habit of practicality was now second nature. Martha turned back to the matron. Her question was not emotional. It was logistical. "How many children?" she asked. "And how much can you carry back?" They did not wait for an answer. They moved with the quiet efficiency that had become their hallmark. They loaded the buggy with sacks of dried apples and root flour. They wrapped wheels of goat cheese in damp cloths. They added bundles of dried mint and yarrow for tea, herbs Mary knew were good for fever. The matron stood by, silent, watching the two women she had dismissed as useless save the lives of the children she was charged to protect. The power had reversed so completely, so silently, that there was no need to speak of it. When the buggy was full, the matron climbed back onto the seat. She picked up the reins, but then she paused. She looked at her hands for a long moment before reaching into a small pocket sewn into her dress. She pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. It was the one object that had been left with them, as infants, on the orphanage steps. The institution had kept it, a final piece of their identity held in administrative trust. She held it out. Her hand trembled slightly. "This is yours," she said. She did not say, "I was wrong." She did not say, "I am sorry." The words were unnecessary. The return of the locket was an act of profound surrender. It cost her the last remnant of her authority over them, the last piece of a past she had written. It was a partial acknowledgement, an incomplete apology, which made it more honest than any grand speech. It was enough. Martha took the locket. Its metal was cool against her calloused palm. She looked not at the matron's face, but at the heavy load in the buggy and the darkening sky to the east. "The roads will be bad in the lower valley," she said. You should start before the sun is high. It was a simple, practical observation. It was also the purest form of forgiveness they knew how to offer. The matron nodded, once. She flicked the reins, and the buggy creaked away, down the hill, carrying life back to the place that had once dealt in survival. Decades folded into one another. The sisters grew old. Their hair turned the color of winter snow. Their movement slowed, but their hands were never idle. The farm became a fixture, a testament to a different kind of wealth. They never married, never had children of their own, but their legacy was written in the full pantries of every farm in the valley. They had taught a generation how to ask the land for what it could give. Martha died first. It was a warm evening in late summer. She was sitting in her favorite chair on the porch, a woven basket of beans in her lap, ready for shelling. Her head was tilted back, her eyes closed, as if listening to the sound of the crickets. She looked like a woman who had just finished a long and satisfying book. Mary lived for 2 more winters. She was quieter without her sister, but not lonely. The farm was full of life. The great-grandchildren of Ember still patrolled the barn. She spent her last days reading, surrounded by the books she had collected over a lifetime. She was found one morning in her bed, a book about celestial navigation resting on her chest, a contented smile on her face. The fire in the hearth was still warm. Outside, the wooden drying racks stood like patient sentinels, waiting for the work of spring to begin. The town they had saved buried them side by side on the hill, overlooking the farm they had built from nothing. They had fed hundreds. They had taught dozens. The single headstone, carved from local granite, bore their names and a single, short sentence. It read, "They knew how to ask the land." You have a place inside you that the world has dismissed. A skill they had no category for. A quiet knowledge they called useless, a strange obsession that didn't fit. You have been standing outside the door to your own cave for years, believing the world when it told you it was empty, believing it was just a dark and useless space. What if you stopped believing them? What if you pried open the stone? What if you stepped into the quiet dark and discovered the cool, still air of your own strength? What if the very thing that will save you, the thing that will feed you and those you love, is the very thing you were once told to leave behind? That small, hand-drawn map led them not to a treasure of gold or silver, but to a piece of difficult, windswept ground. The world will always tell you what you are not. The land, in its quiet and patient wisdom, only asks what you can build. If stories of quiet resilience and earned strength are what you seek, subscribe and join us for our next history, where we explore the life of the river pilot who mapped the one channel through the rapids that everyone else insisted was impassable.